Maya Caldwell had spent the entire day working on a difficult case at the FBI field office. It was late at night when she finally got a chance to take a break. She decided to stop at a small convenience store near her home to grab a quick snack before heading in for the night. The store was quiet, with only a few customers browsing the shelves. She picked up a bottle of water and a protein bar, paid at the counter, and walked outside. As she stepped out into the cool night air, she noticed a police car parked a few feet away. She didn't think much of it at first. After all, officers patrolling the area was nothing unusual. But as she turned towards her car, a voice called out sharply, "Hey, stop right there." Maya turned to see a uniformed officer approaching her with a stern look on his face. His name tag read Grayson. He had one hand resting on his belt near his holster, and his expression was full of suspicion. "What were you doing in that store?" he asked, his tone accusatory. Maya frowned slightly, confused by the question. "I just bought some snacks," she replied, holding up her small bag. Officer Grayson didn't seem convinced. "I got a report about a suspicious person inside," he said. "You match the description." Maya raised an eyebrow. "A suspicious person? I was just buying food." She kept her voice calm, not wanting to escalate the situation. But the officer took a step closer, his stance tense. "I need to see some ID," he demanded. Maya sighed quietly, already recognizing where this was going. She had seen situations like this play out before, only this time, she was in the middle of it. She slowly reached into her jacket and pulled out her wallet, flipping it open to reveal her FBI credentials. "I'm Special Agent Maya Caldwell, FBI," she said firmly. "There's no reason for this." Grayson barely glanced at her badge before shaking his head. "Nice try," he said. "That's not real. Where's your driver's license?" Maya felt a surge of frustration, but kept her expression neutral. "It is real," she said. "If you just call it in, you'll see." Before she could finish, Grayson suddenly grabbed her arm. "Turn around," he ordered. Maya's heart pounded, but she stayed calm. "You're making a mistake," she said as he twisted her hands behind her back and pulled out his handcuffs. "Yeah, I don't think so," Grayson muttered as he tightened the cuffs around her wrists. By now, a few bystanders had stopped to watch, their eyes wide with concern. One man pulled out his phone to record. Maya took a slow breath, steadying herself. She knew exactly what was happening, but Grayson had no idea who he had just arrested. And soon, he would regret it. The cold metal of the handcuffs pressed against Maya's wrists as Officer Grayson led her toward his patrol car. She could hear whispers from the small crowd that had gathered, their voices filled with confusion and concern. A few people were recording the scene, but Grayson didn't seem to care. He was focused only on getting her into the car. "You're making a big mistake," Maya said, keeping her voice even. Grayson scoffed. "The only mistake I see is someone trying to fake being an FBI agent." He shook his head as he opened the car door. "You think flashing some fake badge is going to get you out of trouble." Maya took a deep breath. She had dealt with stubborn people before, but this was different. He wasn't even trying to listen. She could have argued more, but she knew it wouldn't help. Instead, she let him push her into the back seat, deciding to wait. The drive to the station was silent except for the occasional crackle of the police radio. Grayson didn't say much, only glancing at her through the mirror from time to time. Maya sat still, her mind running through what would happen next. She had no doubt that once they reached the station, things would change quickly. When they arrived, Grayson pulled her out of the car and led her inside. The officers at the front desk barely looked up at first, treating it like any other arrest. But as soon as one of them saw Maya, his expression shifted. "Hey, wait a minute," the booking officer said, frowning. "Who is this?" "Some lady trying to pass herself off as FBI," Grayson replied, sounding pleased with himself. "She was acting suspicious at a convenience store." Maya held back a sigh and turned to the booking officer. "My name is Special Agent Maya Caldwell," she said calmly. I work with the FBI. The room went silent for a moment. The officer behind the desk blinked, then looked at Grayson. Did you check her ID? Grayson waved a hand dismissively. It's fake, obviously. The booking officer hesitated, then reached for Maya's wallet, which Grayson had placed on the counter. He opened it and inspected the badge carefully. His face paled. Without a word, he picked up the phone and made a call. Grayson frowned. What are you doing? I'm calling the chief, the officer replied, his voice suddenly serious. And I suggest you think very carefully about what you've just done. Grayson's confidence wavered. He shifted uncomfortably as he glanced at Maya, who was watching him with calm, steady eyes. Minutes later, the station's police chief walked in. He took one look at Maya, then at her badge, and his face tightened. Uncuff her, he ordered sharply. Grayson hesitated. But Chief, I said now. With shaky hands, Grayson reached for his keys and unlocked the cuffs. As Maya rubbed her wrists, she met his eyes. He was finally realizing his mistake, but the real consequences were only just beginning. Grayson's hands trembled slightly as he removed the handcuffs from Maya's wrists. He had been so sure of himself just moments ago, but now, as he stood face to face with the police chief, he felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The room was silent except for the soft clink of the metal cuffs as they were unfastened. Maya calmly rubbed her wrists, feeling the soreness where the cuffs had been too tight. She didn't say anything yet. She didn't need to. The change in the room was obvious. Officers who had previously ignored her were now looking at her with wide eyes. Some whispered quietly, while others avoided eye contact altogether. The chief turned to Grayson, his expression hard. Step into my office. Now. Grayson hesitated. Chief, I was just. Now, the chief repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. Grayson shot one last look at Maya before following the chief into the office. The door shut behind them, and though she couldn't hear every word, she could tell from the tone that it wasn't going well for him. One of the other officers, the one who had recognized her badge, stepped forward awkwardly. Agent Caldwell, I'm really sorry about this, he said. We had no idea. Maya held up a hand. Save it, she said simply. I want my belongings back. The officer nodded quickly and rushed to retrieve her wallet and phone from the evidence desk. Maya checked to make sure everything was in place before slipping them into her pocket. She could feel eyes on her as she did so, as if the entire station was holding its breath. Minutes later, the chief's office door swung open. Grayson walked out, his face pale, his jaw tight. He looked straight ahead, refusing to meet anyone's gaze, before heading straight for the locker room. The chief followed him out and turned to Maya. Agent Caldwell, he said, his voice controlled but firm. I want to personally apologize for what happened tonight. Maya tilted her head slightly. And what exactly did happen tonight, Chief? The chief sighed, glancing around the room before looking back at her. A serious lapse in judgment, he admitted, one that will be dealt with accordingly. Maya held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. Good, she said, because this isn't over. She turned and walked toward the exit, her back straight, her steps measured. As she pushed open the station doors and stepped into the night air, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number. The person on the other end picked up almost immediately. Caldwell. Yeah, she said, glancing back at the building behind her. We have a problem, and I'm going to need internal affairs on this. The night wasn't over yet. In fact, this was just the beginning. Maya stepped away from the police station, the cool night air helping her clear her mind. She had just been released, but the events of the past hour still lingered. She was a trained FBI agent, someone who had spent years enforcing the law, and yet she had just experienced the very thing she worked to prevent: an abuse of power. She took a deep breath and focused. There was no time for anger. She had a choice now. She could walk away and let the department handle things on their own, or she could take action to make sure this never happened again. The choice was obvious. She held her phone close to her ear as the person on the other end spoke. "Internal Affairs," the voice said. "This is Agent Lawson." "Lawson, it's Caldwell," Maya said. "I need you to open a case immediately." There was a brief pause. "What happened?" Lawson asked, his tone serious. Maya explained everything. How she had been stopped outside the convenience store, how Officer Grayson had refused to believe she was FBI, and how he had arrested her despite showing proper identification. She kept her voice calm, professional, laying out the details as if she were reporting on a case. When she finished, Lawson let out a slow breath. "That's bad," he said. "And the department just let you walk out." "They didn't have a choice," Maya replied. "The chief knew they messed up the moment they saw my badge. But this isn't just about me. If Grayson treated me like this, imagine how he treats people who don't have a badge." There was silence for a moment. Then Lawson said, "All right, I'll get the ball rolling. I'll need statements, footage, and any other records we can pull. We'll make sure this is investigated properly." "Good," Maya said, "because I want this handled at the federal level. No cover-ups." "You got it," Lawson assured her. "We'll take it from here." Maya hung up and stood still for a moment, looking up at the dark sky. She had done her part for now, but she knew the real fight was just beginning. The next morning, the story had already started spreading. News outlets picked up the footage recorded by bystanders. Social media exploded with outrage. People demanded answers. Inside the police department, the tension was thick. Officers whispered about what had happened, unsure of what would come next. Grayson, once so confident, now avoided everyone's eyes as he walked through the halls. He could feel the stares, the judgment. And then, the official notice arrived. Internal Affairs had launched an investigation. The department was now under federal scrutiny, and everyone knew this wasn't going to be a simple slap on the wrist. Maya watched it all unfold, knowing she had made the right move. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, and she wasn't going to stop until it was served. The morning after Maya's arrest, the police department was already feeling the weight of what had happened. Whispers spread through the halls as officers checked their phones, reading the news. The video of Maya's wrongful arrest had gone viral overnight, and now the entire city was watching. Officer Grayson sat at his desk, staring at the screen in front of him. His name was everywhere. People were demanding answers. He had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, but he already knew the truth. His career was in serious trouble. At the same time, Internal Affairs had officially stepped in. FBI agent Lawson and his team arrived at the station that morning, walking in with serious expressions. They weren't here for small talk. They were here for answers. The police chief met them at the entrance, his face tense. "We've already started gathering reports," he said, leading them toward a conference room. "We understand the seriousness of this situation." Lawson nodded but didn't respond right away. Instead, he placed a folder on the table and slid it toward the chief. "We've pulled Grayson's record," he said, "and what we found is concerning." The chief hesitated before opening the file. Inside were pages of complaints, reports of unnecessary stops, aggressive behavior, and questionable arrests. Some of the cases had been quietly dismissed, while others had been settled without much attention. "This isn't the first time he's done something like this," Lawson said. "But this time, there's video evidence, and the person he arrested was a federal agent." The chief exhaled slowly, rubbing his forehead. He knew what this meant. The department wasn't just dealing with one bad arrest. It was about to be investigated at a much deeper level. Meanwhile, Maya was already preparing for the next steps. She sat in a quiet office at the FBI field office, reviewing documents. She wasn't just going to let this fade away. She wanted real change. Her phone buzzed, and she picked it up. It was a message from Lawson. "It's worse than we thought. Multiple complaints, all ignored. We need to go deeper." Maya's jaw tightened. She had suspected as much. This wasn't just about Grayson. This was about a system that had allowed him to continue behaving this way for years. Later that day, a press conference was held. The police department had no choice but to address what had happened. The chief stood at the podium, his face serious as reporters bombarded him with questions. "We take this matter very seriously," he said. "An independent investigation is underway, and we are fully cooperating." But Maya knew that words weren't enough. Actions mattered. And she was going to make sure that this time, real justice was served. As the investigation deepened, more and more details came to light. Grayson wasn't the only one with complaints against him. The department itself was about to face its biggest challenge yet, and Maya was ready for whatever came next. The investigation into Officer Grayson and the police department had now gained national attention. News channels covered the story, social media was filled with discussions, and people demanded accountability. The video of Maya's wrongful arrest continued to spread, forcing the department into a position they could no longer ignore. Inside the FBI field office, Maya sat across from Agent Lawson, reviewing the latest findings. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about one officer. There was a pattern. Several complaints had been filed against Grayson over the years, but none had led to serious action. Even worse, some complaints had mysteriously disappeared from official records. "This isn't just about him," Lawson said, shaking his head. "Someone has been protecting him." Maya leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers on the table. "That means we need to go higher," she said. "Find out who's been covering for him and why." At the police department, tension filled the air. Officers avoided talking about the situation openly, but everyone knew things were changing. Some supported the investigation, knowing that bad officers made the whole department look bad. Others, however, were not so happy. Grayson sat in his home, suspended from duty, scrolling through news articles about himself. His face was everywhere, and the comments were brutal. He had gone from being a respected officer to the face of a national scandal. He clenched his fists, anger burning inside him. He had never thought something like this would happen. Then his phone rang. He hesitated before answering. "Yeah." "You need to stay quiet," a voice on the other end said. It was someone from the department, though Grayson wasn't sure who. "Don't say anything to the media. Just lay low." Grayson swallowed hard. "Are they really going to fire me?" There was a pause before the voice replied. "It's not looking good." Meanwhile, Maya and Lawson had gathered enough evidence to take things to the next level. They scheduled a meeting with the district attorney, presenting everything they had found. The DA listened carefully, his expression serious. "This is enough to open a full-scale corruption investigation," he said finally. "Not just against Grayson, but against anyone who helped cover up his actions." Maya nodded. "That's exactly what we need." The next morning, arrest warrants were issued, not just for Grayson, but for 2 other officers and a supervisor who had helped bury complaints. The news spread like wildfire. For the first time, the department was being held accountable. As Maya watched the developments unfold, she knew this was only the beginning. Real change didn't happen overnight, but this was a step in the right direction. Grayson had thought he was untouchable, but now he was about to learn that no one was above the law. The morning air was tense outside the police department as FBI agents arrived with official arrest warrants. The officers inside had been expecting this, but that didn't make it any easier. For years, things had been swept under the rug, but now the truth was coming out. Inside, Officer Grayson sat at his desk, staring at the wall. He had been placed on unpaid leave, but he still showed up, hoping that somehow things would turn around. He had convinced himself that this would blow over, that the department would protect him like they always had. But today was different. The doors swung open, and Agent Lawson walked in, followed by a team of agents. The room fell silent as the officers turned to watch. No one moved. No one spoke. Lawson walked straight up to the chief's office and knocked once before pushing the door open. The chief stood behind his desk, his face grim. "You have the warrants?" the chief asked, though he already knew the answer. Lawson placed the documents on the desk. "Officer Grayson, Sergeant Mitchell, and Lieutenant Davis, all of them are being taken into custody for obstruction of justice, misconduct, and falsifying reports." The chief sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead. "This is bad for all of us," he muttered. "No," Lawson corrected. "It's bad for the people who abused their power. The rest of you have a chance to make things right." Meanwhile, in the main office, Maya entered, her presence commanding attention. Officers who had once ignored her now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here for justice. Grayson finally looked up as she approached. His face was pale, his confidence shattered. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "I was just doing my job." "No," Maya said firmly. "You were abusing your badge. And now you're going to face the consequences." Before Grayson could respond, 2 FBI agents stepped forward. "Officer Grayson," one of them said, "you're under arrest." Gasps rippled through the room as they cuffed his hands. He didn't fight. He couldn't. Reality had finally sunk in. As he was led away, Maya watched him go. This wasn't just about him. This was about all the people who had suffered because of officers like him. People who hadn't been believed, who had been ignored. Today, they had justice. The other 2 officers were arrested as well, taken from their desks as their colleagues watched in silence. Some looked relieved. Others looked afraid, wondering if they would be next. As the FBI agents exited the building with the arrested officers, Maya stepped outside and took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been waiting for. But she knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of real change. And she would make sure it didn't stop here. The news of the arrests spread quickly. Reporters stood outside the police station, capturing every moment as Officer Grayson, Sergeant Mitchell, and Lieutenant Davis were escorted to waiting vehicles. The flashing lights from the cameras reflected off their faces, their expressions a mix of shock and defeat. Inside the station, the remaining officers were silent. Some whispered among themselves, while others stared at their desks, avoiding eye contact. The department had been shaken to its core. No one had expected things to go this far. Maya stood outside, watching as the cars carrying the arrested officers disappeared down the road. She felt a sense of accomplishment, but she knew this wasn't just about removing a few bad officers. Real change had to happen within the entire system. Agent Lawson walked up beside her, arms crossed. "We did it," he said, "but this is only the first step." Maya nodded. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. There has to be accountability, new policies, better training, something more than just punishment." Lawson sighed. "That's going to take time." "I know," Maya replied, "but it's worth it." Over the next few weeks, the investigation continued. More officers came forward, sharing their concerns about misconduct they had witnessed, but had been too afraid to report. Some admitted that they had looked the other way in the past, but were ready to do better. The police chief held a press conference, announcing that major reforms were coming. The department would implement new oversight measures, body camera policies would be strengthened, and officers would receive additional training on ethics and accountability. Maya watched from her office as the chief spoke. She knew words weren't enough, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Grayson and the other arrested officers faced trial. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Recorded complaints, falsified reports, and even security footage that contradicted their past statements. The jury didn't take long to reach a verdict. Guilty. When the sentence was announced, Maya felt a deep sense of relief. Justice had been served. But more importantly, people were now paying attention. One evening, as she walked out of the FBI field office, a young woman approached her, Agent Caldwell. The woman said hesitantly. Maya stopped. "Yes. I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, her voice emotional. A few years ago, I had a bad experience with the police, but no one listened. Seeing what you did, it gives me hope." Maya felt a warmth in her chest. This was why she fought. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "Change is coming. We just have to keep pushing for it." As the sun set, Maya walked to her car, knowing that the fight for justice was never truly over. But today, at least, was a victory, and she was ready for whatever came next.